He had turned away 17 women in 18 months. Daughters of senators, heiresses to cattle empires, beauties who could have had any man from here to St. Louis. And Silas Mercer sent every single one of them home in tears or silence. The town of Caldwell Flats had stopped calling him selective. Now they called him broken. Some whispered worse, but on the morning a lone rider appeared through a wall of white snow. No dowry, no family name, no angle. Silas felt something crack inside his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not desire, not even curiosity. Something far more unsettling, recognition. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. This one's worth it. The snow started before dawn and didn't apologize for it. By the time gray light crept over the Bitterroot Range and spilled across the valley floor, 8 inches had already buried the fence posts along the eastern pasture, and the cattle, what remained of the herd after the brutal November cull, had pressed themselves against the south-facing barn wall, like they understood something the sky wasn't finished saying yet. One of the ranch hands, a lean kid named Duff, who'd been working Mercer land for 3 seasons, stood at the bunkhouse window with a tin mug going cold in his hand and watched the white coming down in thick, slow curtains. "She ain't stoppin'," he said to nobody in particular. Nobody in particular agreed. 300 yards away, across the frozen yard, past the stone water trough filled with ice and the 2 split-rail fences that marked the inner boundary of Mercer land, the main house stood the way it always stood. Square, dark-windowed, heavy. It had been built in 1871 by Silas Mercer's father, a man named George who had come west with $40 and a disposition towards stubbornness that the Montana Territory had rewarded handsomely. The house wasn't beautiful, exactly. It had never been meant to be. It had been meant to last, and it did. 2 stories of lodgepole pine and river stone, a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides, a chimney stack on the east end that exhaled smoke in slow gray columns even now, even in the worst of it. Inside that house, Silas Mercer was already awake. He was always already awake. He sat at the long table in the kitchen, a table built for a family that had never materialized, with a ledger open in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago without him noticing. The numbers in the ledger were fine. The numbers were always fine. That was one of the few things in Silas Mercer's life that behaved the way it was supposed to. He was 36 years old. He owned 11,000 acres of some of the most productive cattle land in western Montana. He had water rights, timber rights, mineral claims on 2 adjacent parcels, and a reputation that stretched from Missoula to the Wyoming border. He had a strong jaw, dark eyes, set a little too deep beneath a heavy brow, and hands that, despite the wealth, still carried callus and old scar from years of doing the work himself before the work outgrew him. He was, by every visible measure, the kind of man a woman should want to marry. Caldwell Flats had been testing that theory for the better part of 2 years. The first to try had been Margaret Hollis, eldest daughter of the Hollis banking family out of Helena. She'd arrived in September of '83 with her mother, her aunt, a personal maid, and enough luggage for a month's visit, though the visit lasted only 9 days. She was handsome and educated and spoke 4 languages, which impressed nobody in Caldwell Flats, but impressed her family enormously. She sat across from Silas at a supper arranged by the territorial magistrate's wife, a woman named Clara Benz, who had appointed herself the social architect of the valley. And she talked about Paris, and about the importance of maintaining Eastern connections, and about how a man of Silas's standing deserved a wife who could represent that standing appropriately. Silas had listened to all of it. He'd refilled her wine glass. He'd asked 2 polite questions. Then he'd driven her back to the hotel in town himself, walked her to the door, thanked her for the pleasant evening, and never called on her again. Her mother, it was reported, had cried. Margaret herself had not, which told you something about her, though what exactly remained a matter of local debate. Then came Adelaide Pruitt, whose father owned the largest freight operation between Billings and the Canadian border. Then the Carey sisters, who arrived together as though offering Silas his choice, which struck him as both presumptuous and faintly insulting to both of them. Then a school teacher from Butte, whose name he couldn't quite hold in his memory afterward. though he remembered she had a laugh like a door hinge and opinions about proper ranching he hadn't asked for. 17 women, 18 months. He hadn't been cruel to any of them. That was the part that confused people. He hadn't been rude or dismissive or cold in any open, identifiable way. He'd been polite. He'd been attentive during the prescribed social events. He'd been exactly what a man of his position was supposed to be in company. And then afterward, nothing. No follow-up, no interest, no door left ajar. Clara Benz had confronted him about it once, in the direct way she confronted everyone about everything. "You're going to die alone in that house, Silas Mercer," she'd told him over the counter of the general store, loud enough that 3 other people pretended not to hear. "That's a possibility," he'd said, and bought his flour and coffee and left. The town had constructed several explanations for him over the months. Arrogance was the most popular. He was too wealthy, too proud, believed no woman was good enough. Some said he preferred his own company so completely that marriage genuinely held no interest, which spawned a subset of whispered theories he ignored entirely. A few of the older residents, people who'd been around long enough to remember the Silas Mercer of 9 years ago, said nothing at all when the subject came up, and changed the subject with the practiced ease of people protecting something that wasn't theirs to tell. Silas knew what they knew. He just didn't talk about it. The morning the snow began its serious work, he'd been at the ledger since 5. At 7, he heard boots on the porch and the knock that meant Hector, his foreman, a barrel-shaped Mexican-American man of 50-something who had been running the daily operations of Mercerland for longer than some of the ranch hands had been alive. "Come in," Silas said, without looking up. Hector came in, stomping snow from his boots with more noise than was strictly necessary, which was his way of registering displeasure before he said a word. "South pasture fence is down in 2 places," he said. "Wind got under the wire sometime in the night. We've got maybe 30 head wandered into the timber." "How far?" "Not far. They're dumb, but they're not suicidal. They'll be up against the tree line." Hector paused. "I'll take Duff and the Reyes kid. Take Callum, too." "Callum's got a bad ankle." "Callum's ankle is fine. He's been milking that ankle for 6 days." Silas looked up for the first time. "Take him." Hector didn't argue. He knew Silas was usually right about which injuries were real and which were convenience. He stood for a moment, holding his hat in front of him, turning the brim slowly. It was a habit he had when he wanted to say something he wasn't sure would land well. "Go ahead," Silas said. The Beaumont family wrote again. "I know. Their daughter is apparently "I know what their daughter apparently is," Silas said. "Write them back. Thank them. Tell them I wish her well." "That's the 4th time you've said that about a different woman." "Then I wish a great many women well. Go get my cattle back." Hector put his hat on and went. Silas sat with the cold coffee and the ledger and the snow coming down outside the window, and felt the quiet of the house settle back around him like something familiar and suffocating at the same time. The kind of quiet you get used to the way you get used to a stone in your boot. You stop noticing it hurts and start thinking that's just what walking feels like. Set. He was outside by 8 because the fence wasn't going to inspect itself, and because the house, for all its solidity, could press in on a man if he stayed in it too long without moving. He'd built the habit of physical work into every day regardless of what the ledger said or what the weather decided. It was partly temperament and partly something more calculated. A man who let his hands go soft while other men worked for him became a different kind of man, one he had no interest in becoming. He pulled on his sheepskin coat, his heavy gloves, his hat that had been broken in over so many winters, it no longer needed to be pushed into the right shape. It found it on its own. The cold hit him the moment he stepped off the porch. Not a cold that surprised. It was the kind you'd been told about all morning by the light and the silence, the way sound stopped carrying as far as it should. 15 degrees, maybe. Wind out of the northwest, cutting across the open yard with a low, sustained sound like something breathing badly. He walked the fence line along the north boundary first, checking what the night had done. 2 posts leaning. Wire holding, just. Ice had built up on the gate latch, and he worked it loose with his gloved fingers, making a note to bring oil next round. He was crouched at the 3rd post, checking where the base had heaved in the frost, when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not from the direction of town. From the north, which meant the high road, the one that came down from the mountain pass. The road people used when they didn't know the valley roads, or when the valley roads weren't an option. It was not a road people traveled in weather like this by choice. He straightened and turned. The rider came through the snow at a walk. A single horse, a bay with a white mark on its nose, head low against the wind. And on its back, a figure bundled so thoroughly in a brown wool coat and a scarf that the only human thing visible was the lower half of a face and two eyes squinting against the flurry. The horse saw Silas and slowed further. The rider looked up. Even from 40 yards he could see the exhaustion. Not the theatrical kind. Not the kind that meant a long, comfortable journey had been inconvenient. The kind that had been earned honestly, over miles and hours, and a stubbornness that refused to stop when stopping would have been the sensible thing. The rider pulled up just beyond the gate and didn't speak for a moment, just looked at him. The horse breathed heavy clouds into the air. "Is this the Mercer Ranch?" she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "It is," he said. "I was told there might be work. For someone willing to work." A pause. "Or shelter, if there's no work. Just for the night. I can pay." He studied her. The horse was solid but tired. The coat had been mended in 3 visible places, and the mending had been done by someone practical rather than skillful. The saddlebags were full but not heavy. The difference between carrying everything you needed and carrying everything you owned was something he'd learned to recognize at distance. "Get down before you freeze to that saddle," he said. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It wasn't a refusal. It was the only practical response to a person half frozen on a horse in a snowstorm, and Silas Mercer, whatever the town said about his heart, had never been the kind of man who turned a problem away because it arrived inconveniently. She dismounted without asking for help, which told him something. Her boots hit the ground and she stood for a moment, steadying herself, one hand on the saddle horn, and he could see her legs were stiff from the ride. She walked the horse to the gate and he opened it and she came through. "I'll put your horse in the barn," he said. "I can do it." "You can barely stand up." She looked at him, not offended, assessing. "I'm standing fine," she said. "I'd just as soon see to my own animal." He almost said something about the impracticality of that position given the current conditions, but something in her tone suggested this was a hill she'd die on regardless, so he let it go. "Barn's that way," he said, pointing. "House is there. Come in when you're done." He walked back to his fence post. She came in 20 minutes later when he'd moved on to the second leaning post and was working a new brace into the frozen ground with an iron bar and more effort than he'd anticipated. He heard the porch door close and went back to the post. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he came in, coat off, scarf unwound, hands wrapped around the coffee cup he'd left, still cold, and looking around the kitchen with the steady, uninvasive attention of someone who was curious but not intrusive. He saw her clearly for the first time. He struggled to assign her a specific age and settled on somewhere in her 30s. The kind of face that hadn't been protected from weather, not out of neglect, but out of a life that hadn't had time for protection. Strong features, a wide mouth, brown hair pulled back in a way that had started orderly sometime yesterday and was less so now. There was a scar along her left jawline, faint and old, shaped like a parenthesis. Her hands, wrapped around his cup, were rough in a way that wealth didn't produce. She looked up when he came in and didn't drop her gaze the way people sometimes did under direct attention. "I took your coffee," she said. "It was cold. I hope that's all right." "It was already cold," he said. "It's still cold. Didn't want to assume I could use your stove." He moved to the stove without a word and got the fire going under the coffee pot. She watched him and didn't fill the silence with nervous conversation, which he registered without meaning to. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Millbrook," she said. East of here. That's 30 miles. Closer to 34 the way the road went." He turned and looked at her. "You rode 34 miles in this?" "It wasn't this when I started." She glanced at the window. "It got persuasive about midway." "What's in Millbrook?" "Nothing anymore." She said it without drama, just fact. "I had a homestead claim there. Couldn't work it anymore. Came looking for somewhere that could use a pair of hands." "What kind of hands?" "Any kind that's needed," she said. "I can cook well enough. I can mend fence, tend livestock, work a garden. I know enough about horses to be useful with them. I've done basic carpentry when there was no one else to do it." She paused. I'm not trying to talk my way into charity. If there's work, I'll do it. If there's not, I'll rest the horse and move on tomorrow. Where would you move on to? I haven't decided that part yet. The coffee pot began to make sounds. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat down across the table, which was the largest piece of furniture in the room, built to seat 8 and usually seating 1. What's your name? He asked. Eliza Rowan? Silas Mercer. I know, she said. The man at the last crossroads told me. He also told me you had a reputation for turning people away. He wasn't wrong. He said you'd turned away 17 women in the last year and a half. 18 months, Silas said, and 17 is accurate. He seemed to find it scandalous, she said. I found it interesting. Interesting how? She looked at her coffee. A man who keeps saying no to something he theoretically wants is either very particular or very scared. She looked back up. I don't mean that as an insult. I'm the same way about plenty of things. He regarded her. Most people who said things like that were performing honesty, staging it for effect, waiting for him to be impressed by their frankness. She didn't look like she was performing anything. She looked like she was just saying what she thought because it was more efficient than not saying it. You said you had a homestead claim, he said. Had. My husband filed it. He passed 2 years ago. She said it in the same flat, factual register. After that, I worked it alone for 1 season. Crops failed in July. Couldn't make the mortgage payment come fall. Bank took back what they were owed. A small pause. Which was most of it. I'm sorry, he said. People usually are, she said. I've mostly stopped needing them to be. That was an honest thing, too. He'd said I'm sorry reflexively, and she'd called it out, gently, without cruelty, in a way that acknowledged the gesture and put it down and moved past it. He couldn't remember the last time someone had done that. Did you love him? He asked, and then wondered immediately why he'd asked that. It wasn't a question that had anything to do with whether he had work for her. She didn't look thrown by it. She considered it. I married him because I needed to, she said. I was 22 and my father had died, and I had a younger brother who needed feeding in a situation that didn't have many exits. Nathaniel was... She stopped. Started again. He wasn't a bad man at the start. He got worse. Not all at once. That would have been easier to recognize. Piece by piece. When the harvest went bad, he turned it somewhere. She looked at the table. People under pressure go different directions. Some get harder. Some get quieter. He got... She seemed to look for a word that was accurate without being excessive. Mean. And then he got sick, and then he died, and I felt 2 things at the same time that I'm still not entirely sure I'm allowed to feel simultaneously. Grief and relief, he said. She looked up. Yes, she said. You're allowed, he said. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind working at the window and the sound of the stove. How long has it been empty? She asked, looking around again. The house? It's not a house that has an empty feeling by accident, she said. Someone left it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow continued its indifferent work. 9 years, he said. He hadn't said that number out loud to anyone in Caldwell Flats. He wasn't sure why he said it now to a woman he'd known for 20 minutes, who had arrived from a snowstorm and taken his cold coffee without permission. That's a long time to leave something the same, she said. The house isn't the same, he said. I've rebuilt half of it. I don't mean the walls, she said. He looked at her. She met it directly, without flinching and without pushing. Just observation. The way you might note that a field had been left fallow, not because it was exhausted, but because someone hadn't gotten back around to planting it yet. He stood up and refilled both cups. You can stay in the spare room tonight, he said. Tomorrow we can talk about whether there's something here that makes sense. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I'll put you to work if you stay. Good, she said. And she meant it, which was the thing about her already, after 20 minutes. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and it showed in the particular texture of her words, solid where most people's were hollow. Bob. That evening, Hector came in from the pasture with Duff and the Reyes kid and a limping Callum and the 30 head of cattle he'd been sent to retrieve, which meant the day had resolved the way hard days sometimes did, in practical success and physical misery. He came to the main house to report and found, to his visible surprise, a woman he didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup she'd apparently made from what she found in the larder, working a long needle through a section of torn saddlebag leather with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this kind of repair so many times it required no particular thought. Hector stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then looked at Silas, who was at the counter reading a telegram that had arrived while they'd been out. "This is Eliza Rowan," Silas said without looking up from the telegram. "She's staying the night, possibly longer." Hector looked at the woman. She looked at him. "I made soup," she said. "There's more, if you want it." Hector had seen a lot of things in his years on Mercer land. He processed this one for a moment with the care of a man who understood that some situations were better observed than commented on. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, in exactly the same tone Silas had used 3 hours earlier. There were onions that needed using before they went. Hector ate his soup. He said nothing. But when he left the house and walked back to the bunkhouse in the snow, he had the particular expression of a man who had just seen something small move that he had not expected to move. She was up before him the next morning. He came downstairs at 5 to find the kitchen already warm, coffee already on, and Eliza Rowan standing at the window with a cup in her hand, looking out at the dark yard with the same quality of stillness she'd had the night before. Not absence, but the presence of someone comfortable enough in their own head to not fill every moment with motion or noise. She heard him on the stairs and turned. "I found the coffee," she said. "I see that. I also found a rip in the kitchen curtain. I sewed it. I hope that's all right." He looked at the curtain. The rip, which he had known about for perhaps 2 years and never addressed, was gone. The mending was clean. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I woke up at 4 and couldn't get back to sleep, and I don't do well sitting still." He poured himself a cup and stood across the kitchen from her. Through the window, the snow had stopped in the night, and the sky was beginning its gray pre-dawn shift. The yard looked scoured and clean and very cold. "Why couldn't you sleep?" he asked. She considered this. "New places," she said. "I never sleep well in new places. I wake up, and I don't know what sounds are normal. What sounds woke you?" There was a board that creaked. In the hallway, about 2 in the morning. "That's the second board from the top of the stairs," he said. "The nails worked loose. It does that when the temperature drops." "Ah," she said. "Good to know." She paused. "It takes me a few nights to learn a house." "A few nights, not the night." He noted that and said nothing about it. "The Beaumont family sent a letter," he said. She glanced at him. "Is that who was on the telegram?" "That was something else. The letter came last week." He looked out at the yard. "They have a daughter, 23, by all accounts accomplished and suitable. Are you going to see her?" "No." "Why not?" He turned the cup in his hands. It was a question people asked him differently than she'd just asked it, usually with an undercurrent of challenge or exasperation. She asked it the way she asked most things, with plain curiosity, no angle behind it.
"Paganda said..."
"Because I know before she gets here what the visit will be," he said. "Her family wants the land and the position. She wants..." He stopped. "She wants what she's been told she should want. And I can't..." He stopped again. "I don't want to be someone's accomplishment," he said. "I don't want to be the thing someone acquires." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I wouldn't want that either." "Then you understand." "I understand the why," she said. "What I don't understand is what you're waiting for instead." He looked at her. "You don't want to be acquired," she said. "So what do you want?" The kitchen was warm. Outside, the cold was still absolute. He had not been asked that question, that specific stripped-down version of it, in so long that he had to locate the answer the way you locate something you put down in a different house years ago. "I want someone who would have come here if the land didn't exist," he said. "If the house wasn't here. If there was nothing to gain." He paused. "Someone who would want..." He shook his head. "That's not how it works. People don't make decisions divorced from circumstances." "No," she said. "But they make different ones for different reasons." "What does that mean?" She looked at her coffee. "I came here because I needed shelter and work," she said. "I knew who you were when I rode in. I didn't come here to marry you. I didn't come here to impress you. I came here because I was cold and my horse was tired and I didn't want to camp in that. She gestured at the window. There's no calculation in that. It's just what was real. That's different, he said. Is it? You're not trying to get anything from me beyond a night's shelter. I'm trying to get work, she said. If you're keeping score on who wants what from you, that counts. He almost smiled. Almost. It's a different kind of wanting, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He gave her work, not because she'd made a good argument for it. She hadn't made an argument at all. She just stated what was and let him draw his own conclusions. But because the practical case was genuine. The ranch was short 2 hands since October, when a pair of brothers from Missoula had decided the wages in Butte were more compelling than the wages here. The house itself was maintained to the level of functional but not beyond, and Silas had long since stopped noticing what the corners and cracks said about the kind of attention that had been absent. Eliza Rowan noticed. Quietly and without comment, she began to address things. Not all at once. Nothing dramatic. A broken latch on the cold pantry door was fixed on the second morning without her mentioning it. A window that had been letting cold air through a gap in the lower sash was resealed with material she found in the barn. She organized the kitchen storage system with a logic that was more efficient than what had preceded it, did it over the course of an afternoon while he was out working the fence line, and explained it to him in 6 sentences when he came back in. He didn't tell her to stop. He found he didn't want to. You're going to work yourself out of accommodation, he said, on the 4th night. They'd fallen into the habit of sitting at the kitchen table after supper with coffee, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The not talking was its own thing, not uncomfortable, which continued to surprise him. I'll find more things, she said, without looking up from the boot she was resoling. The stitching was careful and practiced. You can't resole your way into permanent employment. I can try, she said. Eliza. She looked up. It was the first time he'd used her name directly, and he hadn't planned it. The south barn needs recaulking, he said. The henhouse roof is compromised on the east face. There's a drainage problem in the northwest pasture that's been a problem for 3 years, and I've been meaning to address it. He paused. Those are real jobs, not invented ones. She looked at him for a moment. Are you offering me a position? I'm telling you what needs doing, he said. Whether that's an offer or an observation is up to you. She went back to the boot. I'll start on the henhouse tomorrow, she said. The roof will get worse before it gets better if you wait. I know, he said. The drainage thing. I'd need to see it to know what's required. I'll take you out there. All right. He sat with his coffee. She sat with her boot. The woman 9 years ago, she said, not looking up. What happened to her? He was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. The wind was mild tonight, just movement rather than pressure. She left, he said. Why? Another long pause. He turned his cup. She said I was easier to be away from than with, he said. That I made her feel... He stopped. Distant. That I was never fully in the room, even when I was standing right next to her. Eliza set the boot down and looked at him, not with pity, something more careful than that. Was she right? She said. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was the only honest thing to do. Yes, he said, and you've been thinking about that for 9 years. Among other things. Did she leave for someone else? No, he said. She left for herself, which is harder to argue with. He paused. Her name was Catherine. She's in Portland now, I understand. She's happy. That must have been difficult, Eliza said. Finding that out. It was, he said, and it wasn't. She deserved to be happy. He looked at the table. I just couldn't seem to be part of how that happened. The kitchen was quiet. She picked up the boot again, pulled the thread through, and tied it off. You're not distant now, she said. Right at this moment. He looked at her. You're here, she said simply. I can tell when someone's here and when they're not. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. He finished his coffee and went to bed and lay in the dark for an hour listening to the ranch settle around him in the cold and thought about the particular quality of sitting in a kitchen with someone who noticed things without making you feel observed. It had been a long time since a room had felt occupied by 2 people rather than one person, and a silence. He wasn't sure what to call that. He was fairly sure it mattered. Bang. At the end of the second week, a man came to the door. His name was Fletcher Rowe, and he was the sort of man who arrived places on good horses and wore his prosperity on the outside where everyone could see it, a heavy beaver fur coat, polished boots that were going to be ruined by the walk from the gate, a face that had recently gotten used to being agreed with. He had a son who worked in territorial land administration and a daughter who played piano, and he was, by his own account, extremely well connected in Helena. He was also apparently in the market for an alliance. "Mr. Mercer," he said at the front door. "Fletcher Rowe. I believe you know my brother-in-law, James Cutter." "I know who he is," Silas said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Rowe?" Rowe smiled the smile of a man who hadn't been asked that particular question with that particular flatness in quite a while. He recovered quickly. "I wondered if I might speak with you about a matter of mutual interest." "Come in." They sat in the front room, a room Silas rarely used because it was formal and cold and had always seemed to him like a room meant for performing a version of himself he hadn't been able to commit to. Rowe sat across from him and was halfway through a prepared speech about family reputation and territorial standing and the importance of strategic partnerships between established landowners when the kitchen door opened and Eliza came through it carrying a stack of mended curtains she'd been taking back to the back bedrooms. She stopped when she saw the visitor. "Excuse me," she said. "I didn't know you had company." Rowe looked at her. The assessment was brief and unsubtle. "And you are?" "Eliza Rowan," she said. "I work here." "I see," he said, and there was a word sitting underneath those two words, a word that he was too careful to say out loud but not careful enough to hide. He looked back at Silas. "As I was saying, my daughter Millicent has—" "You can say what you came to say," Silas said, "but I'll tell you the outcome now so you don't waste more of the ride back." Rowe blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Whatever arrangement you're describing, I'm not interested. Your daughter is probably a fine person. I hope she finds what she's looking for." He stood. "I'll walk you out." Rowe stood slowly, visibly recalibrating. His eyes went to Eliza again, who was watching all of this with an expression of careful neutrality, curtains still in her arms. "I see," he said again, in a different way this time. "I doubt you do," Silas said, "but that's all right." He walked Rowe to the door and watched him cross to his horse, watched the horse turn and pick its way carefully back down the frozen drive, and stayed on the porch until he was gone. When he turned back inside, Eliza was standing in the hallway with the curtains. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't interrupt anything worth continuing," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "He was going to say something about me," she said. "Before you cut him off." "Yes," Silas said. "Something unflattering." "Probably." "You didn't let him say it." "No," he said. She looked at the curtains in her arms. "Thank you," she said. Not the automatic kind of thank you, the kind that had weight behind it. "Don't thank me," he said, for the third time since she'd arrived. He had nothing to say worth hearing. She nodded and went down the hall, and he went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and watched the shape of the man's horse disappear over the ridge, and felt something in his chest that was neither righteous nor complicated. It was simpler than that. He'd just been tired of people like Fletcher Rowe walking through doors they hadn't earned the right to walk through, and tired of performing patience at them, and tired of the particular weight of a house that had 17 rooms and one person moving through them. Outside, the snow on the ridge caught the afternoon light and went briefly gold. He thought about what she had said 4 nights ago. "You're here. I can tell when someone's here and when they're not." He was here. Right now. At this window. In this kitchen. In this cold that was also, somehow, beginning to feel 1 or 2 degrees less absolute than it had a few weeks ago. He was here. That was something, he thought. After 9 years. That was maybe something. Tishem. The drainage problem in the northwest pasture was worse than Silas had described it. Eliza stood at the edge of the low ground 3 days after the Rowe visit, boots already sinking an inch into the frozen muck beneath the snow crust, and looked at what years of ignored water flow had done to a corner of otherwise good land. The ice had pushed up in pressure ridges along the natural channel, backing water into the pasture instead of moving it toward the creek line where it belonged. Come spring thaw, this section would be standing water for 6 weeks at minimum, which meant no grazing, which meant the south herd would be crowded onto the upper pastures at exactly the time they needed room. Silas stood beside her and said nothing, waiting. "You'd need to recut the channel," she said. "About 40 feet, maybe 45. Then grade the edges so it doesn't back up again when the ground freezes next winter." She looked at the creek line. "If you put a simple rock weir there, nothing complicated, just enough to slow the flow. It'll give the channel time to drain instead of jumping the banks." "How do you know about weirs?" he asked. "My father built them," she said. "He farmed bottomland in Wisconsin. Water management was the difference between a good year and a ruined one." She paused. "He used to say water is patient. It'll wait you out if you don't give it somewhere better to go." Silas looked at the pasture. "We can't do anything until the ground softens." "I know, but if you start in March, before the full thaw, you'll have it done in time." She looked at him. "It's not complicated work, just stubborn work." "Most things are," he said. They walked back through the snow toward the fence line, and she noticed he'd slowed his pace without appearing to, not in an obvious, performative way, but adjusted, the way people do when they've been walking with someone long enough to find the natural speed between them. She noticed that kind of thing, had always noticed it. Nathaniel had walked 3 feet ahead of her every time they went anywhere, and she'd spent years reading significance into that gap before she understood it was just who he was. Silas walked beside her. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it. That was the 3rd week. By the 4th, she had established a rhythm in the house and on the land that felt not comfortable exactly, because comfort implied a settling she didn't trust herself to do yet, but functional, workable. She knew which boards creaked and at what temperature. She knew that Hector took his coffee with too much sugar and would never admit it. She knew that the Reyes kid, whose name was actually Marco, was teaching himself to read from an almanac he kept under his bunk and was embarrassed about it. She knew that Duff, the youngest hand, had a sister in Spokane he wrote to every Sunday, and that the letters came back infrequently, which he pretended not to track. She learned a household the way she learned most things, by paying attention without announcing she was paying attention. What she was less certain about was Silas. She understood the surface of him well enough by now. The discipline, the way he moved through work, efficient and unhurried, without the aggressive energy some men use to prove something. The fact that he read, seriously, not just the newspaper, and that the books on his shelf were broken-spined and annotated in cramped pencil in the margins, which meant he argued with what he read rather than just absorbing it. The way he could sit in silence without it becoming a demand that someone fill it. What she didn't understand was the wall, not the obvious one. She'd known about that from the first conversation. But there was a second one, subtler, that she kept running into unexpectedly. Moments where she'd say something that landed in a particular spot, and she'd see him register it and then very quietly take a step back inside himself. Not shutting down entirely, just retreating to a safe distance that had been carefully measured over years. She didn't push at it. That wasn't her nature. And even if it were, she had enough sense to know that walls built over 9 years didn't come down because someone wanted them to. She just kept showing up, which was all she knew how to do. It was on a Tuesday, the sky brittle and pale, temperature dropped back to single digits after a brief warmer stretch, that Hector came to find her in the barn where she was replacing a broken stall board and said, in the careful way he said things he wasn't sure were his business to say, "You should know that the row man wasn't the last. There'll be others." She kept her hands on the board. "I know. Some of them will have lawyers." She looked at him. Lawyers. There are families that think they can make a legal argument for why Silas should be interested in a marriage arrangement. Hector leaned against the stall door with his arms crossed. "It's happened twice. Once a man came from Helena claiming Silas owed a debt to his father-in-law that could be settled by marriage to his daughter." He paused. "The debt didn't exist. Silas paid a real lawyer to say so." "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Hector was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man choosing words with more care than usual. "Because you've been here a month and you're still here," he said, "and that's different." She turned back to the stall board. "I'm here because there's work." "Yes," Hector said. "That's what I said." And he left, which told her everything about what he actually meant. She held the board against the frame and drove the first nail and thought about what different meant when Hector used it. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon and didn't arrive at a conclusion, which was probably the honest answer. That evening, Silas found her in the kitchen doing something she hadn't done in front of him before. Sitting still, doing nothing. She had a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she was staring at the middle distance in the particular way of someone conducting an argument with themselves. He sat down across from her without a word, and poured his coffee and waited. She didn't make him wait long. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask." "Catherine." She said the name carefully. "When did you know it was over? Was there a moment, or did it just—" She moved her hand, a gesture meaning dissolve. He thought about it. He didn't perform thinking. He actually did it, which she'd come to recognize as one of his characteristics. "There was a moment," he said. "We'd been together 3 years. We were supposed to have dinner, and I came in late from the south pasture, which lost a calf, and it took longer than it should have. And she'd waited, kept the meal warm. And when I sat down, she looked at me across the table, and I could see she was deciding something." He turned his cup. "She didn't say anything that night. Didn't need to. I saw her make the decision, and I knew what it was. And I sat there, and I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't reach across the table. I just let the moment happen." "Why didn't you reach across the table?" "Because I thought there'd be another moment," he said. "There's always another moment. Until there isn't." Eliza was quiet, looking at her tea. "Nathaniel used to drink," she said. "Not always. It came and went. When things were good, he didn't need it. When the harvest failed the first time, he found it again, and it found him back." She turned the cup slowly. "The hardest part wasn't the bad nights. I could survive those. The hardest part was the morning after, when he'd be himself again. The man I'd thought I was marrying, apologetic and careful, and I'd think, there, that's him. That's the one. Maybe this time." She pressed her lips together. "And it never was. It was just the space between." "How long did you think that before you stopped?" "Longer than I want to admit," she said. "Almost until the end." She paused. "He got sick in the winter before he died. Chest sickness. He was bedridden for 2 months, and in those 2 months he was clear-headed and quiet, and he said he was sorry more times than in the whole rest of our marriage. And I believed him. And then he died, and I spent a year trying to figure out whether that version of him, the sick, sorry, quiet one, was the real one, or just another space between. Which did you decide?" "I decided there probably wasn't a real one," she said. "Or there was, but it got buried so deep under everything else that it didn't matter. You can't love a person who only exists in the brief pauses of someone else." Silas was very still. "No," he said. "You can't." Outside, wind moved against the house, and the second board from the top of the stairs creaked, just the temperature dropping, just the nail working in the wood, and neither of them startled at it because she'd been here long enough to know that sound now, and he'd known it for years. "Why do you stay?" he said. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. "I told you, there's work. There's work in Millbrook. There's work in Billings. There's work in a dozen places that are easier to get to than this." He looked at her steadily. "Why here?" She held his gaze. She could have deflected. She was good at deflecting when she wanted to be. But he just told her about Catherine, about the moment he hadn't reached across the table, and she thought about what it cost him to say that. "Because this felt like somewhere I could be useful without having to be anything else," she said. "Most places a woman alone shows up. There's something expected of her, a story she's supposed to perform. Here, you just handed me a list of broken things and told me to get to work." She paused. "I didn't know how much I needed that until it happened." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're more than useful," he said. "That's not what I meant to say." "What did you mean to say?" He was quiet. She could see him at the edge of something, the way you can see a person standing at the edge of a drop, weighing it. "I don't know yet," he said, and because it was honest, she accepted it. There were things in the weeks that followed that she didn't expect. She didn't expect that he would ask her opinion on things that weren't her business to have opinions on. The decision about whether to expand the herd in spring, a dispute with a neighboring rancher about a shared water access point, a letter from a land speculator out of Chicago that was offering 3 times market value for the eastern parcels. "What would you do?" he asked, about the speculator's letter, setting it across the table to her one morning with the directness that had become one of the things she recognized about him. She read it. What do you want to do? I asked you first. Turn it down, she said. The eastern parcels are where your best grass will be in 10 years once you get the drainage sorted. You sell that now, you're trading the ranch's future for a number that sounds impressive and will feel ordinary in 5 years. He took the letter back. That's what I thought. Then why ask? Because I wanted to see if you'd say it, he said, or if you'd say whatever you thought I wanted to hear. She held his look. That would be a waste of both our time. Yes, he said, it would. He wrote back to the speculator that afternoon. Decline, final, no further correspondence necessary. She didn't expect Hector to warm to her the way he did. Not quickly, not all at once, but in the slow, practical way of a man who watched and waited and eventually decided the evidence warranted a shift. He started consulting her about the house stores without being asked, which was a form of acknowledgement from Hector that carried more weight than a speech would have. He also once said, "You're the first person in 3 years who's figured out how Silas takes his coffee without asking him twice," which he said to the wall rather than to her, and then walked away, so she was free to interpret it however she chose. She didn't expect Marco to show her the almanac. He'd left it on the kitchen table one morning, accident or not, she was never certain, and she'd picked it up and leafed through it and seen the words he'd been practicing in the margins. Not notes, just the same words written over and over in the careful, effortful script of someone learning the shape of letters. January, February, sunrise, sunset, latitude, longitude. When he came in for breakfast and saw her holding it, his face went through 3 things in quick succession. I was using it for the moon cycles, he said. I know, she said. The margin on the planting calendar gave it away. She set it down. My brother learned to read at 22. It took him 6 months. He could read newspapers by the end. Marco looked at the table. I'm 24, he said. It takes longer when you're older. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it takes exactly as long as it takes. She paused. I could help if you wanted. In the evenings, if Silas doesn't need me for something. He looked up. Whatever answer he'd prepared for rejection or condescension, he hadn't prepared for that. All right, he said. And that was how she spent 3 evenings a week at the far end of the kitchen table with Marco and an almanac and a second-hand primer she found in the storeroom behind 3 years of accumulated harness parts. Silas watched this without comment for 4 days and then said, one morning, there are better books for that in the study. Take whatever he needs. She looked at him. The primer is insufficient, he said, looking at his coffee. There's a McGuffey reader on the second shelf and a geography book. He might as well learn something useful while he's at it. She went to the study and found the books exactly where he said they'd be, and she stood in the study for a moment looking at the shelves, at the broken spines and the pencil marks in the margins, at the systematic, argued-with way he'd read everything in this room, and thought about a man who spent 9 years alone in a house full of books making arguments in the margins because there was no one to make them to out loud. She brought the books back and didn't say anything about the study. But that night, after Marco had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, she looked at Silas across the table and said, Why do you mark up your books? To remember what I thought, he said, when I read something again. Do you read them again? Sometimes, to see if I think the same thing. Do you? He considered it. Sometimes yes. Sometimes the margin note is embarrassing, like reading a letter from a younger, more certain version of yourself. What's the most embarrassing one? There's a note in Thoreau that says, in my own handwriting, this is obvious. And now I read the passage and I think, no, it isn't. Not at all. He paused. 30-year-old Silas was an idiot. What does the passage say? He looked at her for a moment, then stood and went to the study and came back with a book, Walden, worn nearly to pieces, and found the page and pushed it across the table to her. She looked at where his finger pointed. I learned this at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. She read it twice. You wrote obvious next to that, she said. I wrote obvious next to that, he confirmed. And now? He looked at the page. Now it seems like the hardest sentence I've ever read, he said. Confidently, that's the word. Not hopefully, not carefully, confidently. She pushed the book back to him. I've never read Thoreau. You can borrow it. I might make my own marks. That's fine, he said. Arguments are better when there are two sides. She took the book. She held it for a moment, feeling the worn spine, the weight of how many times it had been picked up and put down. Then she set it beside her tea, and something shifted in the kitchen, some temperature in the air between them that she didn't name and didn't look at directly, the way you don't look directly at something fragile you're afraid of breaking. It was 3 days after the Thoreau conversation that Clara Benz came. Eliza had heard about Clara Benz from Hector, from Duff, and from the specific way Silas's expression went flat when her name came up. Not hostile, just armored. Clara arrived in a wagon driven by her husband, a quiet man named Edgar, who had the bearing of someone who had learned decades ago that his primary role was to be in the vicinity of Clara rather than to participate in whatever Clara was doing. She came in like weather. I heard about the Rowe visit, she said to Silas in the front room, where Eliza was mending a curtain she'd taken down for washing and had decided to stay visible rather than disappear, because disappearing implied something she wasn't interested in implying. Rowe is telling everyone in town that you've— Clara paused, looked at Eliza with the precise assessment of a woman who missed nothing, made arrangements. Mr. Rowe is incorrect, Silas said. That's not what he's— Clara. He said her name the way you set something heavy down. Eliza Rowan is employed here. She works on this ranch. What Rowe chooses to say about that is his problem. Clara looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back, needles still moving through the fabric even. Where did you come from? Clara asked. Not unfriendly. More the question of someone used to knowing everyone's business in a 50-mile radius and encountering an unknown quantity. Millbrook, Eliza said. East of here. The Millbrook Rowans? No. There are no other Rowans in Millbrook that I know of. Widow? Yes. Children? No. Clara's eyes moved over her in the thorough, unselfconscious way of someone who believed personal inspection was a form of due diligence. You can sew, she said, looking at the curtain. Well enough. Clara looked back at Silas. The Beaumont girl is coming to Caldwell Flats in February. Her father told me specifically. I wish her a pleasant journey, Silas said. Silas? Clara, I am not going to have this conversation again. You never have it at all, which is the problem. She sat forward. You're 36 years old. This land is fine, he said. I'm not a dynasty project, Clara. I've told you that. You're also alone in that house. She stopped, looked at Eliza, recalibrated. You've been alone, she amended. The room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a sentence that everyone in it heard, finished in a way that wasn't said. Eliza kept sewing. She was good at keeping her face neutral when she needed to, a skill acquired across years of not giving Nathaniel the satisfaction of knowing when he'd landed a blow. After Clara left, after the wagon turned down the drive and Edgar guided the horse back toward town with the practiced patience of long marriage, Silas stood at the front window for a long moment with his back to the room. I'm sorry, he said. For what? Eliza said. For— He turned. She implied things. She implied things that half the county is probably already implying, Eliza said. I'm a woman working in your house. People will think what people think. It bothers you. She set the curtain down and looked at him directly. What bothers me, she said carefully, is if it bothers you. If you're sitting across from me every night worrying about what Clara Benz is telling people, I'm not. Then say so, and we'll figure out what to do. I'm not, he said again, steadier. What she says doesn't change anything. All right, she said. Does it change anything for you? He asked. What people in town are saying. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I gave up trying to manage what people say a few years back. It takes too much energy, and it never works. She picked the curtain back up. I'd rather just be what I am and let them say what they're going to say. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you? He asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was the same direct, wanting to understand question he used on everything. She thought about it seriously, the way it deserved. Tired, she said, of being afraid of things. Still working on the not being afraid part. It's slower than I'd like. She paused. Someone who's starting to remember what it feels like to have a place that doesn't require her to be smaller than she is. He didn't say anything, but something in his face changed, something subtle and structural. The way a fence line changes when you take the tension off one post and the whole thing settles differently. He sat back down at the table. She sewed the curtain hem. Outside, the temperature had dropped again with the sun going behind the mountains, and the yard went blue-shadowed and cold, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in still air, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence was so thoroughly inhabited by two people that it didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like something being built, slowly, without announcement. In the particular way that things built to last are always built, not all at once, not by grand gesture, but by one steady day after another, by two people who kept showing up and kept meaning it, until one morning you look at what's been made and realize it got there while you were busy doing something else. That something didn't have a name yet. Silas wasn't ready to name it, and she wasn't ready to offer him one. But it was there in the kitchen every evening, and it was there in the northwest pasture when she told him about her father's weirs, and it was there in the margins of a book about a man who went to live in the woods and called it an experiment. It was there, and neither of them walked away from it. That was enough, for now. That was more than either of them had expected to find in February in Montana, in the kind of winter that doesn't apologize, in a house that had been quiet for 9 years and was learning, slowly and imperfectly, what it sounded like to hold two people instead of one. The storm came on a Thursday without much warning, which was the kind of thing Montana winters did to remind you that your plans were suggestions. Silas had seen the sky turning wrong since mid-morning, that particular yellow-gray that wasn't overcast so much as loaded, the way a room looks when someone's carrying something heavy toward the door. He'd sent Hector to bring the horses into the north barn by noon, and by 2 o'clock the wind had shifted to due north and was coming down from the pass with the kind of sustained pressure that pushed through every gap in every wall and made the buildings sound like they were working harder than usual just to stay where they were. By 4, it was a full whiteout. Hector and the hands made it to the bunkhouse before it closed in completely. Duff had the presence of mind to string the guide rope between the bunkhouse door and the north barn the way Silas had showed him in his first winter, which meant the horses would be tended without anyone losing a hand or a direction in the dark. Marco had stacked firewood against the bunkhouse wall that morning for reasons he said he couldn't explain. Instinct, maybe, or the almanac had said something useful about pressure and wind direction that he was starting to understand. Silas made it to the main house. Eliza was already there, had been there since 3 when she'd finished the henhouse repairs, and seen the sky, and made the practical decision that finishing the northwest fence check could wait. She had both stoves going, the kitchen and the parlor, and she'd filled every large pot with water from the pump before the pump could freeze, and she'd moved the 3-day food stores she'd been building into the kitchen from the cold pantry, which was going to get genuinely cold now rather than just cool. He came in from the back door covered in snow and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the running stoves and the water pots and the food laid out on the counter and said nothing for a moment. "I saw it coming," she said from the stove where she was already starting something that smelled like broth. "Figured we might be here a few days." "Hector and the boys are in the bunkhouse," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "I know. I saw them run the rope." She glanced at him. "Your coat's soaked through. You should change before you sit down." He looked at his coat. She was right. "How long were you watching the sky?" he asked. "Since noon," she said. "Your father built this house facing south, which means the north windows give you about 40 minutes of warning on a front like this if you're paying attention." He took the coat off and hung it. "You've been here 2 months, and you know which windows give warning. I told you. I learn houses." She stirred whatever was in the pot. "Go change. I'll have something hot when you come back." He went upstairs and changed, and when he came back down, she had set 2 bowls on the table and poured coffee, and the kitchen had the particular density of warmth that a room only gets when the cold outside is serious and the fire inside is working against it. He sat down. She sat across from him. The wind found the north face of the house and pushed, and the timbers answered in their old, low voice, and the lamp on the table moved its light without moving itself. "How bad do you think it'll get?" she asked. "Bad," he said. "Could be 3 days, could be 5. "All right," she said. Just that. Not alarmed, not performing calm, just the practical acceptance of a person who had been through hard things and knew that naming them accurately was more useful than either minimizing or catastrophizing. "You've been in a bad one before," he said. It wasn't a question. "The winter of '81, she said. "We were snowed in at the Millbrook house for 11 days. The second week, Nathaniel had found a bottle he'd hidden somewhere, and I didn't know whether I was more frightened of the storm or of being trapped with what the bottle was going to make him." She said it steadily, looking at her bowl. "I spent a lot of that time in the barn with the animals because the barn was quieter." Silas said nothing. She didn't need him to. "This is different," she said. "How?" She looked up. "This kitchen is quieter than that barn was," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at his bowl. "Eat before it cools," he said, and it was the only response he had for something that had settled in his chest like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. Not painfully, but with the awareness of pressure on a place that had been tender for a long time. The first night of the storm was noise and wind, and the house earning its keep. Silas checked the south-facing windows twice for pressure damage and found none. Checked the chimney draw by hand and found it good. Checked the kitchen door seal and replaced a section of worn rope caulk he found pulling away from the frame. Eliza had taken the Thoreau book from the shelf in the study and was reading at the kitchen table when he came back from the door, and she didn't look up but said, "Second shelf from the bottom on the left side has a gap where the cold is getting through. You can feel it if you put your hand there." He went and put his hand there. She was right. "I'll pack it in the morning," he said. "There's old rope in the pantry. I already looked." He stood at the study door for a moment, looking at her at his kitchen table with his book and her tea going cold again. She always forgot about her tea, and felt something that he recognized from a very long time ago and hadn't expected to recognize here, in this circumstance, in this particular winter. It wasn't desire exactly. Or not only that, it was something more domestic and more frightening than desire. It was the feeling of a room being right with a specific person in it. He hadn't felt that since Catherine sat across from him at a dinner that had gone cold between them. He went to bed and didn't sleep well, which was unusual for him. He lay in the dark listening to the storm work on the house and trying to identify what was keeping him awake, because sleep had always been one of the things he could rely on, a function that continued performing even when everything else was complicated. What was keeping him awake was simpler and more alarming than he wanted it to be. He was afraid, not of the storm, not of anything so manageable as weather. He was afraid in the particular way that he recognized from the months before Catherine had made her decision across the dinner table, the fear of something mattering, the fear of the distance between this could become something and this could be taken away. He had lived on the far side of that loss for 9 years by the simple method of never letting anything get close enough to be lost. 17 women, 18 months. Declined letters and polite goodbyes in a house that stayed predictably quiet. And then a woman had ridden through a snowstorm and taken his cold coffee without asking, and sewn up his curtains at 4 in the morning because she didn't do well sitting still, and somewhere in the course of 8 weeks she'd become the most real thing in this house. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning, the storm was worse. Visibility was nothing. The kitchen window showed white on white, the yard completely erased, the barn a rumor in the direction of somewhere. Silas went out at 7 in full winter gear to check the guide rope and the north barn, and came back in 15 minutes later with ice in his beard and a report that the horses were fine and the rope was holding and the bunkhouse had a candle in the window, meaning everyone was accounted for. Eliza had made breakfast. Not the simple kind, actual breakfast, biscuits that she'd been working on since before he went out, a cast-iron pan of potatoes with salt pork, strong coffee. He sat down and looked at the spread and said, "You didn't have to do all this." "I woke up at 4 again," she said. "The nail creaked. I had time." He ate. She ate. The storm continued making its argument against the north wall. "I want to ask you something," he said, and heard his own voice come out differently than he intended, more careful, like he was carrying it. She set her fork down and gave him her attention the way she did, straight and ungarnished. "When the storm clears," he said, "and the roads open up, are you planning to move on?" She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to?" "That's not what I asked." "No," she said. "It's what I'm asking you." She held his gaze. "Because the answer to whether I'm planning to move on depends somewhat on whether I'm being asked to." I'm not asking you to, he said. Then I'm not planning to, she said. For now. For now, he repeated. I don't make longer commitments than I can see the shape of, she said. I've learned that about myself. I can tell you what's true today. Today I don't want to leave. He turned his cup. What would change that? She thought about it honestly. If this stopped being what it is, she said, if it became something else, something I had to perform rather than just... She moved her hand, a gesture he'd started to understand meant exist in. If you started wanting me to be something I'm not. I don't want that, he said. I know, she said. That's partly why I'm still here. The storm pressed at the window. He looked at her and she looked at him. And there was something in the air between them that had been building for weeks and was now, in the enforced closeness of 3 days of whiteout, pressing on both of them in a way that couldn't be walked away from or deferred to some later moment when the conditions were better. The conditions were never going to be better. He knew that. He'd been waiting 9 years for conditions to be better. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to know I'm not saying it to put any pressure on you or to change the arrangement we have. All right, she said. I'm not... He stopped. Tried again. I've been through this house 9 years telling myself I didn't want what I actually wanted because the cost of wanting it was too high. And I've been... He pressed his mouth together. I've been doing the same thing for the last 8 weeks, sitting across from you every night and reading what I could of the situation and deciding every morning it wasn't my place to say anything about it. She was very still. I'm saying something about it now, he said. Not because the storm is romantic or because I've... He made a frustrated gesture. Run out of patience. But because I think you're the kind of person who deserves to know when someone... He stopped. Reorganized. I think very highly of you, he said, which was such a massive understatement that he almost laughed at himself. That's insufficient. I respect you and I like your company more than I've liked any company in a very long time, and I... He paused. I'm aware that what I'm feeling is probably inconvenient for both of us given the arrangement. She hadn't moved. She was looking at him with that direct reading quality, the way she looked at the northwest pasture before she started talking about solutions. Inconvenient, she said. You work here, he said. You've been here 8 weeks. You've told me you've got reasons not to trust men who have power over your circumstances, and I understand that, and I don't want... Silas, she said. He stopped. You're talking yourself out of it while you're trying to say it, she said. I've noticed you do that. He was quiet. What are you actually trying to tell me, she said. He looked at her, at the rough-handed, straight-talking 4-in-the-morning widow who had ridden 34 miles through a snowstorm and taken his cold coffee and sewed his curtains and told him he was here, in this room, in a way she could tell, in a way that apparently no one had been able to tell about him for 9 years. That I don't want you to leave, he said, not because you're useful, because this house is different with you in it, and I am... The word cost him something. Different. And I don't know what to do with that yet, but I thought you should know it was true. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she looked at things she was deciding about, measuring without pressure, without urgency. I know, she said finally. You know. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting to see what you do with it. And? And you said it, she said, instead of deciding not to. He let out a breath. That's not a particularly heroic thing to do. No, she said. It's harder than heroic. She picked her fork back up. I told you I don't make promises I can't see the shape of. What I can tell you is that I'm not... What I feel when I'm in this kitchen, when I'm working this land, it's not nothing, Silas. That's a careful way of putting it, he said. I'm a careful person, she said. I got that way by not being careful enough and then being careful. He understood that. He was that person too, just made by a different road. So we don't call it anything yet, he said. We don't call it anything yet, she agreed. We just keep doing what we're doing. All right, he said. She ate. He ate. The biscuits were good, better than anything that had come out of this kitchen in 9 years, which wasn't a high bar but was a real one. It was on the second day of the storm, in the afternoon, that the thing happened which he hadn't planned for. He'd been in the study going through land records, a box of his father's original deeds, that he'd been meaning to properly organize for 3 years, which the enforced stationary period of a blizzard had finally made unavoidable. Eliza was in the kitchen with the Thoreau, and she had, at some point, made notes in the margins. He'd seen her do it. He'd given her permission. He was not, he told himself, going to look at what she'd written until she offered to show him, because a person's margin notes were their own. He was not going to look. He looked. She'd left the book on the end of the table when she'd gone to check the water pots, and he picked it up with the specific care of someone doing something they're aware is marginal, and he found the passages she'd marked. Next to the Thoreau line about advancing confidently toward your dreams, the line he'd written obvious next to it 30, she had written in her small practical handwriting, only works if you believe the dream is allowed to you. What about people who were told early it wasn't? He stood with the book for a long time. She came back into the kitchen and saw him holding it and didn't look embarrassed. I told you I might make my own marks, she said. You did, he said. Can I ask what you meant by this? She looked at it. Nathaniel used to say I was too ambitious, she said, that I had ideas above my situation, wanting to run a real farm, wanting to breed horses instead of just keep them, wanting… She paused. Small things that he made sound like arrogance. After enough years of that, you stop being able to tell the difference between a reasonable aspiration and an overreach. Those aren't small things, he said. No, she said. I know that now. Took a while. She looked at the book. Thoreau could say, advance confidently, because nobody had spent years telling him that confidence was a character flaw. Who spent years telling you that? Nathaniel, mostly. Some before him. She took the book gently from his hands and set it back on the table. I'm not… She sat down. I'm not looking for you to fix that. I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm just being accurate about why some things take longer than they should. He sat across from her. The horse breeding, he said. She looked at him. You mentioned it when you were talking about Nathaniel, he said, that you wanted to breed horses. It was a dream, she said. The bay mare you rode in on, he said. She's good stock. She's better than good. What line is she from? Eliza blinked, slightly off balance by the direction. Her dam was a quarter horse out of Nebraska. Sire was a Morgan. I bought her from a man who didn't know what he had. She's got remarkable conformation, he said. I've been looking at her every time I go to the barn. She's the only animal I have left from… She stopped. I kept her when everything else went. She was the thing I wouldn't trade. I have a Morgan stallion, he said. 12 years old, good-tempered, good lines. I've been thinking about improving the working stock. He held her gaze. That's not charity. That's a practical proposal about horse breeding. She stared at him for a moment. The thing that crossed her face was complicated. Not just pleased, but something larger and more structural. The particular expression of someone being taken seriously about a thing they'd long since stopped expecting to be taken seriously about. You're not just… I don't make proposals I don't mean, he said. You know that about me by now. She looked at the table, pressed her lips together. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone trying to hold something in that wants to come out. All right, she said. Her voice was even. Yes, when the ground's workable, I'd want to look at him carefully, see what he'd throw. Fair, he said. Outside, the storm was beginning to lose its argument. Still fierce, still driving white against the windows, but with a quality in the pauses between gusts that suggested the weather was working towards something rather than simply continuing. He'd lived in Montana long enough to know the sound of a storm finding its end, even when the end was still a day away. That night, after supper, she asked him about his father. Not about the land or the deeds, or the practical history of how 11,000 acres had accumulated from $40 and stubbornness. She asked what George Mercer had been like as a man. He thought about it. Difficult, he said. Fair. He had a standard, and it was high, and he applied it to himself harder than he applied it to anyone else, which made it hard to resent even when it was exhausting. He paused. He didn't say much. He was one of those men who communicated mostly through what he did. If he thought you'd done something well, he'd give you a slightly harder task. That was the compliment. Did he tell you he was proud of you? Once, Silas said, when I was about 12. He said it and then looked like he'd surprised himself by saying it and changed the subject. He turned his coffee cup. I've thought about that moment more than any other thing he said to me. My father was the same way, she said. He wasn't a man who talked about what he felt. But when my brother and I did something right, he'd stop what he was doing and just watch us for a moment. This quiet, still watching. We knew it meant something, even if we didn't have a word for it. When did you lose him? I was 21. He died in March, first week of the thaw. She looked at the lamp. He'd been in the field since before I was up. I found him at the edge of the east field when he didn't come in for lunch. He was lying down in the furrow like he'd just decided to rest there. She paused. He didn't look like he'd suffered. That was the thing I held on to for a long time. He died in his own field in the spring. There are worse things. What happened to your brother? James? Her face changed slightly. He's in Spokane. He worked the Northern Pacific Line for 3 years, saved enough to open a small hardware store. He's good. She paused. We write when we can. It's not often enough. You miss him. Every day, she said. He's the only person in the world who knows all the same stories I know. She looked at her hands. When you lose everyone else who knew you before you were who you are now, you lose some of the evidence, some of the proof that earlier version of you existed. She looked up. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. It does. He thought about it, about the people who'd known him before Catherine, before 9 years of practiced solitude, who held the evidence of who he'd been when he still moved through the world with something resembling openness. His father was gone. His mother had died when he was 14. He had a cousin in Billings who sent Christmas letters and nothing else. The men in the bunkhouse, he said, know pieces of it. Hector's been here long enough. That's something, she said. It's something, he agreed. They sat there in the late hour of the storm's second night, the fire working steadily in both stoves, the water pots full, the horses safe in the north barn, the guide rope doing its job, the two of them on opposite sides of a table that had been built for 8 and used for 1 for 9 years, and now, in the modest arithmetic of 2 people who had each lost too much and were only slowly learning to stop losing, was beginning to feel like the right size. Silas reached across the table, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He just moved his hand across the worn wood and set it near hers, not touching, not claiming, just near, in the way of something offered rather than taken. She looked at his hand. Then she moved hers and set it beside his, close enough that their fingers touched along one edge. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They both looked at the lamp. Outside, the storm made one more serious effort at the north wall, found it holding, and gradually, over the hours that followed, began to let go. The boards that had been creaking all day went quiet one by one. The draft under the kitchen door eased. The quality of light outside shifted from white on white to a deep blue gray that meant the clouds were thinning, and eventually somewhere up there the moon was doing what it always did, steady and indifferent to what happened to people below it. His hand stayed where it was. So did hers. That was enough. It was maybe more than enough. It was the most honest thing either of them had done in years, and it cost them nothing except the fear of it, and the fear turned out to be the kind that steps aside when you walk through it, rather than the kind that stops you. He would remember it later not as a romantic moment exactly, no such clean category fit, but as the specific sensation of a door he had been standing at for 9 years. And then one day it was just open, and he hadn't even had to push it. He just had to stop walking away. The storm broke overnight. By morning, the world outside was clear and still and brutal white in every direction, and the sun came up over the Bitterroot like it had been held back for 3 days and was making up for lost time. Hector dug the path to the main house himself, which was a significant gesture for a man who typically delegated digging. He knocked on the back door and Eliza answered it and handed him coffee, and he looked at the kitchen, at the 2 cups on the table, at the general evidence of 3 days of 2 people weathering something together, and said absolutely nothing, which was his most eloquent form of communication. He drank his coffee on the porch in the cold and looked out at the white world and had the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was content, finally, to see it arrive. The thaw came in stages, the way it always did in Montana. Not a clean surrender, but a negotiation. Warm days followed by cold nights that froze whatever the afternoon had melted, so the world went slick and treacherous before it went soft. March arrived with mud under the snow, and the particular smell of land that had been held under ice for months beginning to remember what it was. Silas noticed the change in himself the same way he noticed the thaw. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small evidences that accumulated until they were undeniable. He started talking more, not performing conversation the way he had with the 17 women who'd come through his front room, but actual talking, the kind that happened because something occurred to him and he wanted to say it to a specific person rather than file it away in the silence. He'd come in from the pasture and find Eliza at the stove or the table or bent over something that needed fixing, and he'd say things like, "The Northwest Channel is opening up faster than I expected," or "Hector thinks we should move the South herd earlier this year. What do you think?" And she'd answer, and he'd respond to the answer, and 20 minutes later he'd realize they'd had a conversation that had gone somewhere neither of them had planned when it started. He hadn't done that with anyone in a very long time. He'd forgotten what it felt like to think out loud in the presence of someone else. Eliza, for her part, was learning the Morgan Stallion. His name was Campaign, named by Silas's father with the same unironic directness that characterized everything George Mercer had done. And he was 12 years old, dark bay with a broad forehead and the deep chest that marked good Morgan breeding. He was sensible, which in a stallion meant more than people unfamiliar with horses understood. Sensible in a breeding stallion was rarer than beauty and more valuable. She spent a week just being near him before she asked anything of him. She'd go to his paddock in the morning with a handful of oat and stand at the fence until he came to her, which took 3 days. And then she'd work with him at the fence for a while, just getting him used to her hands and her voice, learning what he trusted and what he didn't. Silas watched this from a distance and recognized it as the same method she applied to everything. Patient, observant, not forcing the pace. "He leans left when he's uncertain," she told Silas on the 4th day. "He's always done that," Silas said, mildly surprised. "I thought it was a training gap." "It might be. Or it might be that someone came at him from the right too hard when he was young." She leaned on the fence, watching Campaign move the far end of his paddock. "He's not afraid. He just preferences his left. Once you know that, you work with it." Silas stood beside her, close enough that their arms touched on the top rail. Neither of them moved away. That had become a thing between them since the storm, a physical nearness that had no particular announcement, no negotiated agreement, that just existed because the distance they'd kept for the first weeks had quietly become unnecessary. "His first foal would tell us a lot," she said. "Your mare is ready?" "She's been ready." Eliza glanced at him. "I've been waiting to make sure about him." "And?" She looked back at Campaign, who had stopped at the far fence and was watching them with the particular alert stillness of a horse that was actually paying attention. "He's good," she said. "He's better than good. He's the kind of horse that improves everything he's crossed with." She paused. "Yes." The breeding arrangements were practical and straightforward, and completely unlike the conversation they were having underneath them, which was about trust and patience, and whether the thing you were committing to would produce something worth the risk. They both understood this without naming it. That was another thing that had developed between them. The ability to talk about one thing, while both knowing they were also talking about something else, and finding that more honest than pretending otherwise. It was the 2nd week of March when the Halverson family showed up. They came in a wagon that had seen better decades, 2 adults and 4 children ranging from maybe 5 to maybe 14, the father driving with the careful concentration of a man navigating an unfamiliar road, the mother sitting beside him, holding the youngest against her side in the cold. They pulled up at the gate, and the father got down and knocked on the post, which was what people did when they didn't know the custom of the place. Eliza saw them from the kitchen window and went out before Silas had finished pulling on his coat. She was at the gate by the time he reached the porch. He watched her speak to the man, watched the exchange of a few sentences, watched her posture, which was open and unhurried, and then she turned and called back to him. "Silas, come hear this." The man's name was Anders Halverson. He was Norwegian-born, English spoken with the remnant of an accent that came and went depending on how tired he was. And he was extremely tired. He had a land claim on the eastern edge of Mercer territory, one of the smaller parcels that Silas's father had never gotten around to buying because it was marginal ground, rocky on the south face, good for goats maybe, not for cattle. The Halversons had been on it for 2 years, And the second year had gone badly. Drought in the summer, early frost in September, a cow that died in October and took their dairy supply with it. He wasn't asking for charity. He made that clear with the directness of a man who found asking for anything at all physically difficult. He was asking if there was work, seasonal, temporary, anything, that would get his family through to the planting season when the land might, if the weather cooperated, produce enough to stabilize them. Silas looked at the wagon. At the 4 children who were sitting in the wagon bed with the particular stillness of children who understood that this moment was important and were doing their part by not making it harder. The youngest was asleep against his mother's side. The oldest, a girl of about 14, was watching Silas with eyes that had already learned to read faces for what came next. "Can you drive fence posts?" Silas asked Halverson. "Yes," he said. "Can you mend a barn roof?" "I've done it." "What about your wife?" Halverson looked at the woman, whose name turned out to be Britta. She'd climbed down from the wagon by now and was standing beside her husband with the composed quality of someone who had decided, at some point in the recent past, to stop being embarrassed by her circumstances and just deal with them. "I can cook for a crew," she said, before her husband could answer for her. "I can put up preserves, smoke meat, sew, tend a kitchen garden. I worked a dairy operation in Minnesota before we came west." Eliza turned to Silas. He looked at the family, looked at the wagon, looked at Eliza, whose expression said nothing. No pressure, no leading, just waited for what he would do. "There's a cabin on the south boundary," he said to Halverson. "It's been empty 2 winters. It'll need work before it's warm, but the structure is sound. You can use it through the season, and we'll settle what your labor is worth at the end of it." He paused. "Your wife can work with Eliza on the house stores if that's agreeable. Your older children can earn their keep in the yard." Halverson was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked. He was a man who had probably not heard a straightforward offer in several months, and the absence of conditions and catches seemed to be taking him a moment to process. "That's agreeable," he said. His voice was even. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Silas said. "The south cabin hasn't had a fire in it since November. Your first 2 days are going to be about making it livable." "We've had worse days," Halverson said. "I expect you have." They drove the wagon around to the South Pasture Road, and Silas took Halverson to see the cabin, and Eliza walked with Britta and the children, and the oldest girl, whose name was Inga, fell into step beside Eliza with the alert, watchful quality she'd had in the wagon. "Are you his wife?" Inga asked. "I work here," Eliza said. Inga considered this. "You talk to my father like you had a say," she said. "Not accusatory, observational." "I do," Eliza said. "That's different from being his wife." Inga thought about that for a few steps. "Is it better?" she asked. Eliza looked at her, 14 years old and already asking the right questions. "Some days it's exactly the same thing," she said. "Some days it's not. It depends on the people." Inga nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already been thinking. The Halversons moved into the south cabin that week. It took 4 days of combined effort. Silas and Halverson and Duff working the structure, while Britta and Eliza addressed the interior with the efficient, overlapping competence of 2 women who had both spent years doing what needed doing without waiting to be asked. By the 4th day, there was a functional fire, a serviceable sleeping arrangement, and a smell in the cabin that meant food rather than cold and old wood. Marco taught Anders Halverson how to address the ice on the South Pasture fence line. Not because anyone assigned him to, but because he'd watched Silas do it twice and worked out the method, and when he saw Halverson approaching the same fence with the wrong tool, he walked over and showed him without making a speech about it. Eliza watched this from the gate and thought about what it meant for a young man who'd been teaching himself to read from an almanac to now be teaching something to a grown man with 4 children. She thought about the McGuffey reader on the kitchen table, worn at the corners now. She thought about how Marco's handwriting in the margins had become more confident over the course of 2 months. Less like a man trying to prove something, and more like a man recording something real. She thought about all of this, and then she thought about what Silas had done the day the Halversons arrived, and what it said about the distance between the man Clara Benz had complained about and the man who had stood at that gate and looked at 4 children in a wagon bed and made a decision in less than 5 minutes. She told him so that night. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "With the Halversons." He looked up from the ledger. "They needed somewhere, and I had somewhere," he said. "That's not as simple as you make it sound." It seems fairly simple. Silas, she set her tea down. 6 months ago, before I came here, would you have done the same thing? He looked at the ledger, then closed it. Probably not, he said. I would have referred them to the county land office, told myself it wasn't my problem to solve. What changed? He looked at her steadily. You know what changed, he said. She held his gaze. Say it anyway, she said. Not demanding. Just asking him to do the thing he was getting better at. Saying the real thing instead of the approximation. You, he said. You changed it. The way you see what's in front of you and respond to it without calculation. Without deciding what the angle is first. He paused. I'd forgotten that was a way to operate. He pressed his mouth together. I'd been running the numbers on everything for so long I forgot some things don't require a ledger. She nodded slowly. For what it's worth, she said, I think you would have gotten there without me. Maybe, he said. Probably slower. Definitely slower, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, light, warm, without ceremony, that made him almost laugh, which was not something that happened easily or often, and which she had noticed she could sometimes produce in him if she came at a thing from the right angle. Clara Benz came back in late March. This time she came alone, which was either a more personal gesture or a strategic one, and with Clara Benz the two were not always distinguishable. She appeared on the porch on a Wednesday afternoon while Silas was in the south pasture with Halverson looking at the drainage channel that Eliza had mapped out in January. And she found Eliza in the kitchen with Britta Halverson and Inga, the three of them processing the last of the winter root stores. What was salvageable from what had aged, what needed to go before it was lost, what could be replanted come April. Clara looked at the three women in the kitchen and at the systematic work happening and at the south cabin visible through the window with Halverson children in the yard, and she stood in the doorway for a moment with a particular expression that Eliza, who had gotten fairly good at reading Clara's expressions over 2 visits, identified as someone revising an opinion they'd held for a while. Mrs. Halverson, Clara said, because Clara knew everyone within 40 miles. I'd heard you were here. Word travels, Britta said pleasantly, without stopping what she was doing. Clara looked at Eliza. Silas in the field? South pasture, Eliza said. He'll be back by 4. Clara sat down without being invited, which was her standard approach to most situations. She looked around the kitchen, at the dried herbs on the ceiling hooks, at the organized counter, at the Walden on the end of the table with its multiple sets of margin notes, at the general evidence of a kitchen that was being used fully rather than minimally. This doesn't look like a hired woman's kitchen, Clara said. What does a hired woman's kitchen look like? Eliza asked. Clara looked at her. You know what I mean. I know what you're trying to find out, Eliza said. You could just ask it. There was a pause. Britta Halverson kept working with the careful inattention of a woman who had learned when to be invisible. Inga, less practiced, was watching everything. Are you going to stay? Clara asked. Eliza set down the turnip she'd been assessing and looked at Clara directly. That depends on a number of things that aren't entirely mine to decide, she said. Does Silas know how you feel about him? That's not your business, Clara. No, Clara said. It's not. She paused. But I've watched that man wall himself up for 9 years, and I've watched every attempt to reach him bounce off. And you've been here 4 months, and the South Cabin has a family in it, and Marco Reyes is apparently learning to read. And Silas Mercer came into town last week and spent 20 minutes talking to Edgar about drainage solutions, and did not look like a man who was in a hurry to be somewhere else. She looked at Eliza. In 9 years, Silas Mercer has never not been in a hurry to be somewhere else. Eliza was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Clara looked at her for a long moment with the look of a woman who had been wrong about something and was experienced enough to recognize it without making a production of the recognition. I said some things in January that I didn't mean charitably, she said. You said things in January that you thought were true, Eliza said. I didn't take them personally. You should have. I've had worse said about me by people with less cause, Eliza said. You were looking out for someone you care about. I understand that. Clara picked up her gloves from the table. The Beaumont girl married a man in Billings, she said. In February. Good for her, Eliza said. Yes, Clara said. I thought so too. She stood. Tell Silas I came by, I will. Clara left. Britta watched the door close and then exhaled in the way of someone who had been holding themselves very carefully for 15 minutes. Inga let out a breath that was almost a laugh. She's frightening, Inga said. She means well, Eliza said. Frightening and well-meaning are not mutually exclusive. Silas came in at 4 with Halverson and mud on both of them to the knee, which was the fee the Northwest pasture was charging for early season access. He knocked the worst of it off on the porch and came in, and Eliza handed him coffee and said, Clara came by. And he made the face she'd predicted and said, What did she want? And Eliza said, To revise something. And he looked at her with the slightly narrowed reading expression that meant he was working out what she wasn't saying directly. She was civil? He asked. Clara's always civil, Eliza said. Civility and kindness are different muscles, and she exercises them independently. Halverson laughed, the sudden genuine kind that surprised him. He looked like a man who hadn't laughed at anything in several months. That's true of most people, he said. Where I grew up, we said, a man can shake your hand and be counting your fingers. Your father's sane? Eliza asked. My mother's, he said. Silas looked at Halverson and then at Eliza, and at the kitchen in the particular way he'd been looking at it lately. Not the look of a man surveying his property, but the look of a man who keeps being surprised by how a space he's known for years can keep becoming something he hadn't expected. That evening, after Halverson had gone to the south cabin and the bunkhouse had gone quiet and the yard was still in the way. Late March evenings went, cold still, but a different quality of cold, one that was giving ground. Silas came to find her on the covered porch, where she was watching the last of the light leave the mountains. He stood beside her, not asking anything, just being there, which had become its own language between them. The drainage channel, he said, eventually. What about it? We can start next week, he said. Halverson's good with a shovel. We'll have it done in 3 days if the ground cooperates. It'll cooperate, she said. It's been waiting long enough. He was quiet for a moment, then, I wrote to your brother. She turned and looked at him. I found his address in Spokane from what you told me, he said, with the careful steadiness of a man who knew he'd done something significant and was giving her time to process it before he said more. I introduced myself. I told him you were here and that you were well. I told him, he paused. I told him he was welcome on this land any time he wanted to come. She looked at him for a long moment. The light on the mountains was almost gone. Down in the valley, the Halverson cabin showed yellow light in its window. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. Why did you? He looked at the mountains. You said that when everyone who knew you before you were who you are now is gone, you lose the evidence, he said. I thought... He stopped. I thought maybe James should know where his sister is. And I thought, if you're going to be here, that the people who are part of your life should know where here is. The word if sat in the air between them for a moment, and they both heard it. When I'm going to be here, she said. Quiet, deliberate. He turned and looked at her. When, she said again. Not a question. The valley below them was going dark in the good way. The spring dark, the dark that came later every day now, that conceded the evening inch by inch rather than taking it all at once. The mountains held their snow still, but the lower slopes were showing rock, showing ground, showing the slow return of everything that had been waiting under the ice. He reached out and took her hand. Not near this time. Actually took it, fingers closing over hers, and she turned her hand and held his back, and neither of them said anything else for a while because the things that needed saying had already been said, and the things that were still left unsaid would find their time. They stood on the porch of a house that had been built to last and had lasted, through one long winter and one longer silence, and one woman who had ridden through a snowstorm and taken a man's cold coffee and refused to be anything less than exactly what she was, until what she was had become indistinguishable from what this place was. Below them, in the south cabin, the Halverson children's voices carried faint and high in the cold air. In the bunkhouse, Marco Reyes was probably at his reading by lamplight. Hector, who had seen everything and said very little about any of it, had left the main house porch light burning when he went to the bunkhouse, the way he had started doing every night since February, as if the light were making an argument he didn't need to put into words. The land was coming back, slowly, imperfectly, on its own terms, the way land always does. So were they. James Rowan arrived on a Tuesday in April, 3 weeks after Silas's letter reached him in Spokane. He came by train to Missoula and rented a horse from a livery there and rode the remaining distance, which was the kind of thing a man did when he wanted to see the country his sister had landed in rather than just the destination. He was 31, lean in the way of men who worked with their hands, with Eliza's same straight-on quality of looking at things and the same economy of expression that meant when he did say something, it carried weight. Eliza saw him from the kitchen window when he came up the drive, and she was outside before he'd reached the gate, which was the first time Silas had seen her move toward something at a run rather than at her measured, deliberate pace. She hit the gate, and her brother caught her, and they held on to each other for a moment in the April cold with the particular intensity of two people who had spent too long at a distance and knew it. Silas stayed on the porch. He gave them the space of it. When they came in, James shook Silas's hand and looked at him with the direct assessment of a brother who had received an unexpected letter and ridden a long way to understand what it meant. "You wrote that she was well," James said. "She is," Silas said. "I can see that." He looked around the kitchen, at the herbs on the ceiling hooks, at the Walden on the table, at the general evidence of a space that had been claimed by someone who intended to stay. He looked at Silas. "The letter said I was welcome any time. That's still true." "It also said," James paused, choosing, "it said she was part of this place. Those were the words you used." "They were accurate," Silas said. James held his gaze for a moment, doing the older brother calculation that no man with a sister who'd survived what Eliza had survived could avoid doing. Then he nodded, once, the way men acknowledge something they've decided to trust. "Show me the land," he said. Silas took him out that afternoon. All of it. The northwest pasture where the drainage channel was now cut and graded and doing exactly what Eliza had said it would do. The south barn and the hen house and the field that was going to be planted in 3 weeks with the first real kitchen garden this property had had in nearly a decade. He showed him Campaign in the paddock and the bay mare in the adjacent one, and told him about the breeding plan, and James watched the two horses moving near each other along the shared fence rail and said, "She loves that horse more than most things." "I know," Silas said. "She kept her when she couldn't keep anything else." James was quiet for a moment, his hands on the fence. "She didn't tell me how bad it got," he said. "After Nathaniel, I found out later from a neighbor who wrote to me." He looked at the mare. "She was protecting me. She always did that. Told me enough to keep me from worrying, not enough to make me come and see for myself." He paused. "I should have come anyway." "She would have sent you back," Silas said. "Probably." He looked at Silas. "She's not easy to help." "No," Silas said. "She needs to be useful more than she needs to be helped. Once you understand that, she's easier to be around." James looked at him. Something in his expression settled. "You do know her," he said, less surprised than confirmation. "I'm learning her," Silas said. "There's a difference. They walked back across the field in the late afternoon, stepping around the patches where the ground was still soft from the thaw, and James stopped once to look back at the valley, at the mountains still holding snow on their high faces, at the valley floor coming green in its slow, patchy way, at the south cabin where Halverson's smoke was rising from the chimney. "She wrote to me after she left Millbrook," James said. "She said she didn't know where she was going. She said she was going somewhere that could use her." He looked at the smoke from the south cabin. "I don't think she imagined it looked like this." "Neither did I," Silas said. James left on Friday. Before he went, he sat at the kitchen table with Eliza for 2 hours while Silas stayed deliberately in the study, and whatever they said to each other in that 2 hours belonged entirely to them. When James came to find him before riding out, he shook Silas's hand again, and this time it was different from the first handshake. Less assessment, more acknowledgement. "Take care of her," James said. "She'd object to that framing," Silas said. James almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "she would." He got on his horse. "Take care of each other, then." He rode down the drive and turned north toward Missoula, and Eliza stood at the gate and watched him go until he was over the ridge and out of sight. She stayed there a moment after he'd gone, hands in her coat pockets, looking at the empty road. Silas came to stand beside her. "Thank you," she said. She'd said it before, about the letter. This was different, fuller, carrying more than gratitude for a single action. He's a good man, Silas said. He is. She looked at the road. He told me something. You don't have to. He said that when Nathaniel died, he wanted to come and get me. Bring me to Spokane. He had a room, he said. He had plans. She paused. I told him no. I told him I needed to work it out myself. She looked at her hands. He said he always understood that about me, and that for a long time he was afraid that what I'd work out was how to be alone permanently. She glanced at Silas. He said he was glad I'd apparently worked out something else. Silas looked at the road where James had gone. He's not wrong, he said. No, she said. He's not. They walked back to the house together, and the April mud was soft underfoot, and the mountains were bright in the afternoon, and somewhere in the south pasture one of the Halverson children was yelling something at another one in a tone that suggested a dispute about something that would be forgotten by supper. The first foal came in May. They'd known it was coming. The mare had been showing for weeks, and Eliza had been checking her twice a day with the focused attention she brought to anything that mattered. It came in the early hours of a Thursday morning, and Eliza was already in the barn when Silas got there, had been there an hour, crouched in the corner of the stall being as present and as unobtrusive as possible. The foal was a colt, dark like his sire, with his dam's white nose mark inherited and slightly modified, smaller, more like a comma than a blaze. He was on his feet in 20 minutes, which was fast, which was a good sign. He was curious immediately, which was better. Eliza sat in the corner of the stall with her knees pulled up and watched the colt figure out the first hour of his life, and Silas sat beside her in the straw without caring about the condition of his coat, and they didn't say anything for a long time, because the barn had that quality that barns get at moments like this, something quiet and serious that didn't need commentary. He's good, she said finally. He is, Silas said. Look at those legs. She pointed. He's going to be tall, more Morgan than quarter horse, from the build. That's what I wanted, she said. She was smiling in the particular way she rarely did, unreserved, unguarded, without any of the usual careful management of her own expression. It was, Silas thought, the best version of her face. Not because it was prettiest, but because it was entirely real. He had been carrying something for 3 weeks. He'd been carrying it with the same disciplined patience he'd applied to everything since January, telling himself the timing wasn't right, the moment hadn't presented itself. He didn't want to do it wrong. The problem with that logic was that he recognized it as the same logic he'd applied 9 years ago when he hadn't reached across the dinner table, and he knew now what it had cost him then. The colt nursed for the first time, tentative and then not tentative, and the mare stood with the particular still patience of an animal doing exactly what she was made for. Eliza, he said. She looked at him. I need to say something, and I want to say it right, which means I'm going to say it badly, he said, and I need you to hear what I mean rather than how I'm saying it. She turned to face him more fully, in the straw, in the dim barn light, with the colt making small sounds behind her. I spent 9 years being very careful not to want anything I could lose, he said. I was good at it. The ranch ran. The ledger balanced. Everything was fine in the way that things are fine when you've removed everything from the equation that could make them not fine. He paused. And then you rode through my gate in a snowstorm and took my cold coffee and told me I was present in a way you could tell. And I've been losing the careful not wanting for 5 months now, and I find I don't particularly want to get it back. She was watching him steadily, the careful, assessing look. But there was something in it now that hadn't been there in January. A softness under the steadiness, a willingness to be read in return. What I want, he said, is for this to be permanent. Not the arrangement, not the employment. He looked at her directly. You. Here. With me. As my wife, if you're willing, but more than that, as the person who argues in the margins of my books and tells me where the cold is getting through and knows which way campaign leans when he's uncertain. He stopped. I'm not asking you to rescue me or complete me or any of that. I'm asking you to build something with me that neither of us can build alone. Because I've tried the alone version for 9 years, and it produces a very well-organized ledger and absolutely nothing else worth mentioning. The barn was quiet. The colt shifted in the straw. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. He let her look. He didn't rush it or try to read what was happening behind her eyes, because he'd learned that she arrived at things in her own time, and that her own time was worth waiting for. "You said you wanted someone who would have come here if the land didn't exist," she said, "if there was nothing to gain." "I remember. I want you to know something about that," she said. "I came here because I was cold and my horse was tired. That's true. But I stayed." She stopped. "I stayed because of you, not the land, not the security, you." She paused. "You listened to me. You asked what I thought, and then you actually thought about what I said. You didn't want me to be smaller than I am." She looked at her hands. "Do you know how rare that is? For a woman to be somewhere and have someone just want all of her to show up? Not a managed, presentable version. All of it, including the parts that are difficult and weathered and stubborn." "I know those parts," he said. "I like those parts." "I know," she said. That's why I'm still here." She looked up at him. "Yes, Silas." "Yes," he said, making sure. "Yes," she said again, "though I want it understood that I'm not going to stop having opinions about the ranch management." "I'd be concerned if you did. And Campaign's breeding program is mine to run. I wouldn't have it any other way. And if you go distant on me, if I look across the table and you're not there, I'm going to say so, directly, without waiting for the moment to pass." "I need you to," he said. "That's not a condition. It's a request." She held his gaze. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, which was the most direct and ungarnished thing she'd done in 5 months of direct, ungarnished behavior. And he put his hand against her face and kissed her back, and the colt in the straw behind them was unimpressed and continued trying to understand his own legs. They were married in June, which in Montana is the month the world finally commits to warmth after months of provisional offers. Clara Benz organized the celebration with an energy that suggested she'd been waiting to do this for considerably longer than the 5 months since Eliza had arrived, which Silas noted and chose not to comment on because some battles were not worth the cost. It was not a large wedding. It was not meant to be. The ranch hands came, Hector in a clean shirt that had probably been pressed for the first time in years, Duff, who cried and pretended he had something in his eye, Marco Reyes, who had by now progressed from the almanac through the McGuffey reader to a dog-eared copy of a geography book and was reading the county legal notices on his own time. The Halverson family came, all 6 of them, and Inga wore a dress she'd let out at the hem herself to account for the 2 inches she'd grown since fall. Anders Halverson shook Silas's hand at the door and said, "Good," with the compressed sincerity of a Norwegian man saying something that would have taken anyone else a paragraph. James sent a letter that arrived the week before, and that Eliza read at the kitchen table and did not show Silas, which he respected, and which made her laugh once and press her fingers to her mouth. Edgar Benz stood with Silas before the ceremony and said, in the confidential tone of a man who had been married to Clara for 30 years and had made his peace with the education that provided, "The ones who take longest to find are usually worth the wait." "That's wisdom," Silas said. "It's self-defense," Edgar said, "but it happens to be true." The ceremony was simple. The words were said. The thing was done. What surprised Silas was not the ceremony itself, but the moment after it, when they were standing outside in the June sun, with the Bitterroot visible to the west still carrying its last snow on the high faces, and Eliza turned to him with rice in her hair that Inga had thrown with excessive accuracy, and she looked at him with that direct, full-attention look and said, "You're here." The same 3 words she'd said to him in the kitchen months ago, and he understood then that she'd been watching him since January for evidence that would either confirm or deny the things she'd started to hope, and that this was her telling him the evidence had come back in his favor. "I'm here," he said. And he was. Completely. In the way he hadn't been for 9 years, in the way he was starting to understand might be the most important thing a person could manage. Not success, not the ledger, not the 11,000 acres that his father had built from nothing. The ability to be actually present in your own life. To be in the room you were in. To reach across the table. There is a particular cruelty in the way fear operates on people who've been genuinely hurt. It presents itself as wisdom. It dresses up as reasonable caution and tells you it's protecting you from another loss when what it's actually doing is administering the loss preemptively, on your behalf, before anyone else gets the chance. Silas had believed his caution for 9 years. He'd thought the loneliness was the price of being careful, when really the loneliness was the loss he'd been trying to avoid, already arrived, wearing a different name. Eliza had her own version of this. She'd survived Nathaniel by making herself smaller and harder and more self-sufficient until self-sufficiency stopped being a strategy and became a wall she couldn't see from the inside. The difference between her and Silas was that her wall had been built faster and under more immediate pressure, and some part of her had always known it was a wall, had kept a map of the door, even when she couldn't find it. They were not cured people. That is important to say, because the story of two damaged people who find each other sometimes gets told as a story of completion, as if the right person fills the right hole and everyone is whole afterward. That isn't how it works. Silas still went quiet sometimes, still retreated to a place behind his eyes where Eliza couldn't follow, and when that happened, she'd say, "You went somewhere," and he'd come back, and some days that happened twice before noon. Eliza still woke at 4 in the morning in new circumstances, still overworked when she was anxious, still had difficulty asking for things directly, even from a man she trusted absolutely. They were just people. Imperfect, scarred, making it up as they went. But they were people who had decided to keep showing up, to stay in the room, to reach across the table before the moment passed. That fall, they rode out to the north gate together on a Saturday morning, the gate where she'd first appeared through the snow in January, and he'd stood in his field with his fence post and watched a stranger come toward him out of a whiteout. The gate looked different in September. Everything did. The grass was gold on either side, and the mountains were going through their autumn sequence of color. And the bay mare's colt, 6 months old now, already absurdly leggy, already showing the character that good breeding and a curious disposition produce, was in the near pasture pretending to be more alarmed by the wind than he actually was. Eliza pulled up at the gate and looked back at the ranch, at the south cabin with its new porch railing that Halverson had built over the summer, at the hen house with its repaired east face, at the northwest pasture where the drainage channel had done its job, and the grass had come in thick and late in the season instead of drowning in standing water. At the main house, solid and dark windowed and trailing smoke from the kitchen chimney. "It looks different from here," she said. "It always looks different from the outside," he said. "No." She looked at it steadily. "It looks like somewhere people live." He understood what she meant. It had been somewhere a person lived. One person, going through the motions of a life that was properly maintained and fundamentally hollow, like a building that has all its windows and none of its lights on. Something had been turned on. Not by magic, not by love as transformation in the neat storybook sense, but by the daily accumulation of two people treating each other like they mattered. By soup made from onions that needed using. By a curtain mended at 4 in the morning. By a letter written to a brother in Spokane. By a man who didn't reach across the table for 9 years and then one day did. "I came through this gate thinking I'd stay one night," she said. "I know. I was planning to move on in the morning. I know that too." She looked at him. The scar along her jaw caught the morning light the way it sometimes did, pale and faint, the physical record of years she'd survived. "Why did you say come in?" she asked. "That morning, you didn't know me. I was nobody." He thought about it honestly because it deserved honest thought. "Because you were there," he said, "and the alternative was turning you away in a storm, which wasn't something I was capable of doing regardless of what the town thought of my hospitality." He paused. "And because you were looking at me like I was just a person, not the land or the name or the problem to be solved." He looked at the gate. "I'd forgotten what that felt like." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that most bad winters end," she said, "that you can outlast almost anything if you just keep moving. Don't stop. Don't go inside yourself and stop moving." "He was right," Silas said. "He was." She looked at the gate, at the road beyond it, disappearing north toward the pass where she'd come from, the road that had been cold and empty and long. "I kept moving for 2 years after Nathaniel," she said. "I just didn't know where I was moving toward." "And now?" She looked at him, and the answer was on her face before she said it, clear and uncomplicated and entirely real. The face of a woman who had stopped being afraid of wanting things because she'd found something worth the risk of wanting. "Here," she said. "I was moving toward here." The colt in the near pasture spooked at nothing and bucked twice and then looked embarrassed about it, which was his habit. And somewhere down at the south cabin, one of the Halverson kids was already up and making noise about something, and the kitchen chimney was still pulling good smoke straight up into the still September morning, and all of it was imperfect and real and enough. They turned the horses back toward the ranch and rode home. That is the whole of it. A man who had shut the world out and a woman who had been hurt by letting it in, and the long, undramatic, ordinary work of two people deciding that the fear wasn't worth more than the life on the other side of it. No clean resolution. No moment where the past stopped mattering. Just the slow, stubborn accumulation of days in which they kept choosing each other. And the land around them kept responding to being cared for. And the house that had been built to last kept doing exactly that. The hardest frontier is not the one measured in miles or weather. It's the one inside a person who has been broken and is deciding, one morning at a time, whether to try again. Both of them crossed it. That was enough. That was everything.